So as Jean-Francois mentioned, I'm giving a talk tonight. I'll share my the presentation. Basically, what I'd like to talk to you about is this thing we called Chrome Dev Summit Adventure, and it was an online event experience we created for the Chrome Dev Summit event, which we normally hold every year in San Francisco. So, but I'll do a little bit of a introduction again on my background. So Jean-Francois mentioned that I made a game called Duet in the past. I'm the games lead for the Chrome and Web Developer Relations team here at Google. And yeah, before working at Google, I made about 5 mobile games available on like Android and iPhone. And yeah, I focused on trying to find ways to help or improve the ecosystem for games on the web. But as I mentioned, like the talk I want to give you tonight is about this virtual conference experience I built for Chrome Dev Summit last year. So yeah, last year, Google, like many other companies around the world, had to make that difficult decision to cancel the physical presence of the developer conferences. I think obviously it's like it was a very logical decision in hindsight. Like it was very important that we did that, did those cancellations. And Chrome Dev Summit, of course, was also canceled, even though it was held in November, and that seemed like a really long, time in the future. But we made, that decision to cancel it when COVID happened. And so when we were in the first confinement, the first lockdown, I was thinking about like what is the future going to be like for conferences and that kind of thing. And so I asked myself this sort of simple question of how can we reimagine the best parts of physical events in the digital world? So the solution I came to was this idea called Adventure, or Chrome Developer Summit Adventure. And so the idea is that it would be a real-time multiplayer kind of web game that reimagines conferences in a post-COVID world. That's sort of my pitch for it. And I think it's interesting because I approached it with these ideas of web game development. And I really see like web games as like the web game aspect of it as like a vehicle to solving this otherwise product UX kind of problem of having a conference online and what's the best way to experience that. But yeah, so Adventure, the idea was to combine the magical conferences, like a sense of community and socializing with the discovery of content and learning. And, what better way to engage with users and to drive the exploration and the discovery, but with, a game experience. So in the talk, I'm going to show you how we started with the idea and the prototype I built, and then all the product and technical and decisions and challenges that we tackled from the beginning to the end. So that original idea and question I asked myself, how can we reimagine the best parts of physical events in the digital world? I think it's it's important to start with answering the beginning of that question. Like, what are the best parts of physical events? Like, I think firstly, meeting new people. Of course, at a conference like CDS, it's about meeting other developers, industry folk or Googlers from the Chrome team, and really being able to connect and socialize, and having like hallway conversations. So being able to duck into a private conversation for a business meeting or to catch up with an old friend. Then there's like the whole aspect of exploration and learning. It's great when you can walk into a conference and just to get to explore everything, and it has a kind of vibe and a feeling to it. It's like you're stepping into a temporary mini little world or ecosystem. And then finding the demos and content to discover like code labs and product demos is obviously really important. Be able to like look at what the, these companies that have booths or whatever at conferences want to showcase or highlight as content. And then there's obviously also watching the talks and learning about, product announcements. And then also really importantly, I want to highlight is the swag, So, we can't forget about swag. There's stuff like putting pins on your bag or your jacket and accessorizing, which is a really fun part of kind of highlighting what you like at a conference and what you're, kind of reflecting your personality maybe or your interests. And then, other stuff that happens at conferences as well. So I took these, like all these photos are actually from previous CDSs. and there was like a foosball table. There was this like joke where someone dropped a cake on stage. I don't know if you've watched that particular keynote, but that did happen. And then also there was like jazz music. But yeah, the idea is putting it all together. Like a conference is more than just the sum of its parts. Oh, and actually, I do. Yeah, there was something really funny I noticed when looking through these old photos. That on the left-hand side here, you can even see that there was someone dressed in a dino outfit. And then actually, when I gave this presentation at CDS last year as part of CDS Adventure, someone, one of the GDEs reached out to me and told me that they were in that dino outfit. So they thought it was quite funny that I highlighted it specifically during this talk. So in reflection, the best parts of a conference, in my opinion, are meeting new people, the hallway conversations, exploring a conference, demos and content to discover, and collecting swag and having fun in general. So the question is how do we reimagine all of those ideas from that physical conference into a digital way? Well, yeah, so this comes to the reason why I thought web games would be a great solution. So I realized that games have actually kind of solved a lot of these problems already in the past, right? Multiplayer games in particular, they provide a multiplayer world, which is great for meeting new people. They can have private chat with another player, which is like hallway conversations. Even the tool we're using right now has like private chat kind of experiences, right? And then exploring a conference, it's kind of similar to a game world exploration, or having a piece of content that you walk up to is kind of like, just discovering something in a game world, like you can talk to NPCs or non-player characters. And then there's like collecting swag and collecting pins. Isn't that different to like a loot drop in a video game, right? So collecting a digital item. So I built a prototype to explore this idea. And I built this in actually just over a week using the Construct game engine, which is a really great tool for prototyping, in my opinion. And for the backend, I just used Node.js with some really basic WebSocket logic. And ultimately, it kind of like explored all the ideas that I really wanted to get across with thinking about this idea. So you can see here that the player can walk around the world with just keyboard movement, and it's effectively like an imaginary conference space. I guess in some ways loosely based it on Yerba Buena Gardens, which is where CDS is normally held. Otherwise, the other, like you can see here, I'm bumping into these two characters at the beginning and then that third person there. And those are like NPCs that you can chat to, and there's like little bits of humor and that kind of thing. Just like there would be in a video game, but also that idea of being able to learn something new. And you can meet other players as well, and you can send text chats freely with them and hit enter and type whatever you want. So that's how the prototype worked. And then we had, code labs you could bump into and link out to, that could link to like code labs or product demos or documentation pages. And some experiences were embedded in the game as well. So this is like a Lighthouse performance tool that I'm sure everyone knows about the Lighthouse tool, but we actually made it so you could query the URLs inside of the game, and other people could see the URL score, the URLs being queried and the scores given. That kind of like tried to replicate that feeling of sort of like immersive demos that you get, or like at conferences when it's some kind of like bespoke experience that's been set up. And then obviously the private conversation. So for the prototype, I actually just had it launch into Google Meet calls just from these tables. And that was like a really fun experience. After I built the prototype, I shared it internally with people, and it was just like a really great surprise and delight as to how the experience worked and so forth. And then of course, I thought even for the prototype, I actually implemented a little fishing mini game because I thought like, wow, it seemed like really perfect that it would need a mini game like fishing embedded inside the game world. So in review, this prototype basically demonstrated that the entire idea was completely achievable, like the real-time multiplayer, the private chat, the game world, interactive elements, item collection, and so forth. So now I've shown you a prototype, but going from obviously a prototype to a finished product needs a lot more work. And there are a lot of decisions to make along the way. So one of those decisions was like, how does this fit with our traditional digital event strategy? Well, obviously we have like the YouTube live stream with main talks being broadcast. And at the physical event, that's usually like a real theater we broadcast from. And then there were also, there are individual talks which are pre-recorded, or code labs which developers can do at the event or online. And normally at Google, we run a physical event. When we run a physical event, we have physical experiences like the Lighthouse kind of thing, like these demo sandboxes. But those are kind of like lost when you go online into just an event website. So the idea with Adventure was to make it kind of fit alongside the event website and be like a kind of parallel dimension into the conference's content. So we can just link to all the same content from just a different direction. And I thought that was also a really great highlight of what makes the web so great. And it really demonstrates that power of the URL. Because really setting up that prototype was, just over a week it took to put it together, because I could just link to a bunch of content that demonstrated this idea and kind of drove it all home. And I think that worked really well, having like the regular website where we ran CDS from, and also Adventure as this alternative experience that was also more social as well. Then we thought about like, okay, what are going to be the risks of having truly open chat or like video calls and that kind of thing? Well, we realized that like it was important to have like good moderation and like a bit of vetting as well, perhaps on the attendees and that kind of thing. So we made this sort of early decision that it would be sort of like an experiment, and we would have to, we would learn from it. And so we had this idea that we would do just like at a physical conference where we would have attendees we invite ahead of time and who register to the event. We'll invite a set of attendees and have that traditional registration process. And then people that registered ahead of time that could then speak out loud through the chat. I don't mean like voice or video like I'm speaking to you right now. I mean like through the chat experience. And then for everyone else that was joining, say, that hadn't pre-registered, they would be able to react with emoji and still experience everything else in the world, but not have that kind of chat out loud feature. So normally, normally for CDS, we can only have or pre-register or invite, I think the capacity is something like 1,000 people, or maybe a little bit more for this for CDS. But with CDS Adventure, we were able to invite several thousand as pre-registered people, and we kind of picked a sweet spot of where we were confident the system could scale, and we wanted to like make the best user experience possible for the people that we were like giving that attendee experience to. Then there's the topic of the hallway chats. So there's private conversations, like this sort of thing. So the idea was that we decided to continue exploring this idea that it should mirror a real conference. And obviously in a real conference, what happens? If you want to have a private conversation with someone, you step aside into a private area. And so I think the key to solving this was that since a game world gives you space, that space can actually mean something. So in the prototype, I showed you how I used the concept of a table that could launch into a video call, but obviously connecting strangers at a conference via video chat could lead to some not so great situations. So in the end, we embraced the metaphor of this water cooler. Now, funnily enough, we actually didn't launch with this feature at CDS, but it is something, there was basically some issues we were having with it, and we were a bit concerned about its reliability. So we actually pulled the feature at the last minute. But nonetheless, I think this would have been a really interesting solution, and I'd love to still explore it in the future for conferences. So basically, you step up to a water cooler, and it then puts you into a private conversation with someone else that steps up to it. And then you could imagine having some kind of system where you have like a 10-minute timer or some kind of maybe fuel system for how many private chats you can have per hour. so that people don't like just hog the water coolers and frustrate other players. But we thought that it should just be a short amount of time, just enough time for you to exchange some private information that maybe you need to exchange to then transition to another platform like Twitter or a video conference or something like that. Yeah. So then another question we were like thinking about was like, what should you be able to interact with in the world? And in my mind, I thought like the answer was kind of simple, but also daunting at the same time. Our philosophy was to try and make it that you could interact with everything you can think of. So if you want to encourage exploration in a world and a conference, I think you should make it that people feel rewarded for doing things. So that's about like really gamifying the whole experience. So we made it so that like there were books which linked to web pages, or actually we had like a secret little book that linked to the original Chrome comic book. I don't know if people remember that when Chrome like launched like more than 10 years ago now. There was this online comic book that they published about Chrome. And so we had something like that linking out as a little bit of an Easter egg. But then, if you bumped into plants, actually you could like water the plants. And there was like a progression unlock. And like you got rewarded with a piece of swag for having watered, I think, 10 plants. And then obviously the theater entrance, you just bump into that. And then the lighthouse and so forth, and the NPCs. Another question we had was, how can we differentiate between attendees, Googlers, and bots? Funnily enough, I should have updated this slide, but this was like an original earlier idea of how we would handle it. And we thought about having like a little aura around a Googler. We actually flipped this out to have like a nameplate above you, which every attendee has a nameplate. And then for Googlers, we put that like big G, logo from Google in the nameplate. So it was very clear and distinctive. But we also realized that for the NPCs, we probably wanted something that could visually make it seem like this NPC you're talking to isn't just like a developer, because there are some that are kind of, it's more like a joke of like overhearing some developers talking about something like there were two developers in the game world who were arguing over what's better, tabs or spaces. And so we needed a way to also highlight that maybe a developer, or sorry, an NPC was like a member of staff and is like going to give you some kind of more just information rather than a joke. So we had this idea of the Chrome Dino being like a kind of outfit like that the staff would be wearing. So this isn't how Google has appeared in the game, and this is just like the NPCs. But it worked really well, having like the 4 Google colors and these dinosaur outfits. And we basically took this inspiration from looking through those old event photos and finding that GDE that was in the dinosaur outfit at the beginning of the presentation. And then of course, there's all the virtual swag. So you can here actually have like added them to these people. So these were all things that you could unlock in the game. And we had a lot more in CDS Adventure. But we could use some of them to kind of indicate to people like, what is this Chrome Dino an expert on, or what's he going to be talking about, or he or she. So here, like there's like little fire orb, and we use that to try and communicate the metaphor of like the Firebase product. And then another thing that we tried to think about was how to deal with the visual noise of the conference. And by that, I don't mean like the technical backend scaling. I mean like literally the visual noise on the client of like what happens when all these people are standing next to each other. So one thing we did was we had like a limit on the rendering of the number of guests on screen because the guests or visitors weren't going to be chatting out loud. So, if you focus on saying that you're trying to provide the best experience for the attendees and those people that pre-registered, then that helps sort of focus and guide your decision making, I think. Another one was we had this sort of like micro chat bubble interface. So if people chatted, like a little chat bubble appeared above their heads. And we embraced this idea that like we could not just like have the whole bubble appear all at once, but kind of like make it smaller, but kind of like move through the words of the sentence quickly. And actually at the moment here, it's word by word, but in the final launch, it was more like usually cut up a sentence into like 3 or 4 webs at a time, which worked pretty well. Yeah, then we also had this idea of we would try and organically distribute the players. So we had 4 different spawn locations that when players arrived in the world, they would be dropped into one of those 4. And then the content of the product rooms themselves are spread out in the world. So there was good reasons for people to venture out and explore. And then there were like secrets to discover in different areas. So that also encouraged exploration and, you know, tying that into the item collection and swag. Next, how can we drive virality? Well, actually in my Google I/O talk from 2019, I discussed the power of like the URL in web game design. And I said that to drive virality, you should really leverage the web superpower, which I think is the URL, because I really think that there's like no platform that is more viral than the web, actually, when you think about it. Like when users see a URL, they know that, like they know exactly what it means, that when they tap that URL, they're going to be whisked away to something that could be, you know, could be anything. And yet that trust, you know, like they trust it to completely, right? They trust that they can tap that link and then they can jump into something completely unknown, and yet they'll still be safe through the, you know, the web and so forth. So in fact, here's like the slide from my Google I/O talk on this topic, where I gave examples of game designs you could leverage to integrate with the URL in interesting ways, like competition or collaboration or exploration through a URL. And for adventure, I really try to leverage that exploration mechanic and tying that into the URL. So I can share a link that can teleport a friend into the same room as me, and that's exactly what we did in adventure. So wherever you are in the world, wherever you step, it's constantly changing the fragment identifier in the URL bar. So if you just grab the URL, copy and paste, and drop that on Twitter, your friends will, you know, jump into the same location as you in the world. But yeah, after obviously making all the decisions, we had to really build the thing. And so I needed like a full team to work with. So from my side, I'd worked on games in the past, like I mentioned, one of them, actually Jean-Francois mentioned Duet in particular. So that was like a pretty popular mobile game a long time ago now. But obviously I'm just one person, so I collaborated with an agency called Set Snail, and they're a game development agency based in Aarhus in Denmark. And they're known for creating also another mobile game, Daddy Longlegs. When actually they were also very popular, and we kind of were both popular around the same time back in those days at the App Store. But I hadn't met them before, funnily enough. But together, me and the rest of the team, Brian and Christopher and Eric and Casper and Morten, we collaborated over several months to build the final product. And yeah, it came together really well. But I'll jump into, before like looking a little bit more about the final result and the feedback from the community, I'll look at like, we'll dive into a little bit about the code and how it works. So obviously a good first place is to talk about the backend. So since ultimately this was like an experimental new kind of conference, we set ourselves a goal of like 10,000, being able to support up to 10,000 players across like the whole world. And you know, yeah, there was like a lot of like decisions we had to make along the way to try and like get it to that and experiment with different technology. So one thing was that we knew we'd want WebSockets, and we knew exactly how many clients we'd be aiming to support. So we went with Compute Engine for the servers. You know, although it doesn't auto scale, it gave us support for WebSockets, and we used Docker to make the deployments much simpler. And that way we could just like create more servers if we needed to. For the application stack, we went with Node.js, and we knew we'd want to share game logic between the server and the client. So Node.js was a really good fit. And we used TypeScript for the programming language. And then to scale the backend with our sockets, we went with Redis as a messaging backend. And actually, oh yeah, we were going to use memory store, but we didn't end up using it, I have to admit. So we actually just ran it on like one of the servers, and that was fine. And to simplify the WebSocket logic and management, used UWebSockets, which yeah, we tested Socket.io, but we needed to reduce some of the bandwidth costs. So I think we flipped over to new WebSockets for that reason. And yeah, for the user data, like your avatar customizations and like unlock progression, we stored that in Firebase. So then how do all those things come together? So, well, it starts with like the client connecting to a login server, which we also wrote in Node.js. The login server connected to Firebase for authentication. We authenticate people with Google accounts, and then we wanted to keep things simple. Obviously, Firebase Auth supports all kinds of other federated authentication options, but we just went with just Google accounts to keep it simple. Then the login server would pick a node in terms of like distributing the load. And then the client establishes a direct connection to that node. And then all the game logic, actions, and game state updates fly along that socket connection and synchronized through Redis and Firestore. And yeah, like memory store was more for like messages. Sorry, Redis was more for messages, and Firestore was more for like long-term changes to your avatar and that kind of thing. Now I'll go a bit more about the front end. So we wanted a game client that could render, crisp art and have skeletal animations in 60 frames per second. So we went with Pixie for the graphics renderer because it's pretty widely used for web games and supports WebGL. And then for all our UI, we actually went with React because, since it's the web, we thought it'd be great to just, use web components rather than try and re-implement the wheel with the UI inside the game engine itself. So HTML and CSS gave us all the expressiveness and capabilities that we needed, and it was also better for accessibility. And we picked React because the engineering team was already very familiar with it. And actually, I think we flipped over to Preact to improve the performance. And for the authentication, we dropped in Firebase authentication, as I mentioned. Along the way, we did have some rendering bottlenecks. So it was a bit surprising to me, but Pixie actually doesn't have a built-in concept of a camera. Therefore, we needed to implement client-side culling. So that's when you don't render any images that are not within the current viewport. And then another plugin we used was Pixie Layers. So if I remember correctly, in the game, we are dynamically sorting objects based on their Y position. And because the camera perspective is not bird's eye, it has like a tilt to it. So we need to constantly adjust the sorting of objects for the Z index. And normally in Pixie, when you change the Z value behind the scenes, you are ordering an array of elements. So using Pixie Layer, it actually kind of means that it doesn't need to change that ordering of that array or do a array manipulation. So it was more performant. And then there was Cache's bitmap. I haven't looked at this part of the code for a while, so I'm kind of hazy on it, sorry. But it was like an option you can activate on a container to automatically cache all the sprites beneath it into a single bitmap, which can improve the performance of objects made from combinations of sprites. So our game characters are skeletal based and assembled from different textures. So we could cache all the textures of a single character into a bitmap to improve the rendering performance. And then sprite atlas sorting. So we have multiple sprite sheets in the project, and naturally there's a mix of foreground and background elements split around them, asking the renderer to regularly switch between sprite sheets has an overhead. So having a sprite sheet for all the background images and all the foreground images, and then one for everything in between was a very good idea. And then lastly, object pooling. So this kind of goes back to client-side culling. So when you're walking across the screen, rather than instantiating new objects, which maybe are repetitions of things that you've seen before, you walk and it's the same graphical tiles that you've seen previously, or code labs or whatever. We had object pools, so we could just move the objects over in terms of the renderer and change the properties of what they were rendering. And then I think I originally gave this talk and recorded it several weeks before the event. So when I originally prepared this, I didn't know what else we would need to optimize. but there were quite a few other things. I already mentioned how we flipped from Socket.io to UWebSockets. Maybe in the Q&A something will come back to me. But yeah, I'll show you a little bit of how the product turned out. I should have taken more screenshots. My apologies. But here's a bit of a glimpse of. Oh, actually, we changed the NPC dialogues visually, so they had a bit more of like the CDS styling to them. But anyway, you can see though that the art style of the world was like all worked out. And oh, here you can even see the tabs and spaces, people talking about tabs and spaces, and they held virtual swag related to tabs and spaces. So it worked quite well in terms of the humor. And then in terms of the reaction on Twitter, it was really great actually. So here are just a few tweets that came out. People were sort of pretty blown away by the complexity and the creativity of us that we put into it. This guy said it was the best online experience he'd ever had, which was pretty nice praise. We had like people really enjoying the fishing mini game. You might know that the Fugu product area in Chrome has like a Fugu fish as like a logo for it. So in the Fugu related product room, we had a fishing area where you could fish. Yeah, and then people were just remarking about in general online conferences last year and what the experience has been. They felt it was a really great demonstration on the modern web. People like hanging out on couches. And then I thought this was pretty crazy. Someone said it was like the best thing Google has ever made. But that was a pretty nice compliment to hear. I'm not sure that that's true, but yeah, it's still nice to read a comment like that. Yeah, so I think I'll end this presentation by saying that I think I would encourage you to try and think of ways that you can build interesting experiences on the web using all those kind of like technologies that can be combined so easily. I think that one interesting question to ask yourself, like, what else can the web and game design especially unlock for us? Because I really believe like the web is the best platform for experimentation and rapid prototyping and deployment. And I think Adventure really highlighted what is so great about the web. And I also can tell you that like one of my favorite parts of the project was when I finished the original prototype and I shared a link to it with my colleagues, and immediately they jumped in and started exploring the world I created. And yeah, I think the most important thing is, even if things don't go perfectly with your experiments, even if it's like it turns out to be a bit of a mess, if you you might create something fun along the way, and that's really what it counts. Yeah, so the original prototype, I built that with Construct 3 specifically, and I really can't give it more praise. It's a really great tool for rapid prototyping, in my opinion, for games, and it exports to PWA and mobile platforms like iPhone and Android through Cordova library as well. And I'll also say that you might be wondering, like, are we open sourcing the code for Adventure? So the plan is to open source it. We just haven't gone around to that stage yet, but it should be open sourced probably in a few months time is the timeline. But yeah, otherwise, thanks so much. I think we're going into a Q&A now, so I might stop presenting.
Yes. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you. So people, you can start to ask your question. I start to write lots of questions. Me. So you answer the first question. The name of the engine you used for the prototype was Construct. So, but next question: how do you decide how many users stay on the same at the same time on the screen? What kind of metrics did you use to take your decision?
That's a good question. It was actually really tricky because we wanted it to be this place where everyone could like come together and talk, but at the same time, you kind of need to balance it to have like the best user experience possible. So I think well, I should also mention that we actually set up a system where we could shard the game world and have like multiple versions of the world running. We only did that like once during CDS. And that was sort of our way of saying, okay, this is how many people, where are the Easter eggs? Sorry, I'm just seeing like the new questions appearing. That was our way of kind of like balancing that decision process, because if you build a world that's too big, but then there's not enough players in it, then it's going to be empty and not feel so good. I know this question is more about how many people are like displaying how many people on screen at the same time. So one thing that we also did was if two players like stand on top of each other on the grid, and this was a good part of having a grid-based world, we made it so that one person randomly is picked to be like in front, and then the other person behind them. But then there's like in the UI, it says like it's this person plus one, and you could click that their name tag to then get like a list of all the people standing on that spot. So that way, as long as we like double checked that the rendering didn't suffer if everyone was on screen at the same time, that worked pretty well in terms of scaling. And it's like each grid spot can sort of scale in terms of number of people on a grid.
Okay, so again about visual noises, how did you deal with making evolving the number of attendees according to your place on the map? So just to be sure, you are rendering the map as the attendees who are working in the map, or you pre-render everything and
so we render it as the player walks around. The evolving number of present attendees. So yeah, I guess that kind of connects back to what I was just saying of if two people stand on the same spot, that kind of like collapses into just one person is shown. And so that's a good way to balance the performance and also the user experience of not feeling like you're completely overwhelmed. Like that screenshot I showed earlier of like everyone on screen at the exact same time. That was actually before we had that kind of duplicate kind of system. So it was even noisier because it was rendering like 3 or 4 people standing on the same spot, and you could see like too many pieces of swag pointing out from behind the player, I believe. But yeah, like I said in the talk as well, designing the world so that it encouraged people to want to explore helped kind of like spread them out.
Okay. Did you consider that Firebase real-time database could be a good for such use case, or to replace WebSocket or not?
It's a good question. I think for like a real-time game, you probably wouldn't want to rely on Firebase, like Firestore, for example. I think the performance isn't fast enough for what we wanted. But it sort of just depends, I guess, on just how responsive you want it to feel in terms of the world reaction. So I think because actually we had done a previous event, something for a previous CDS. We did something called Big Web Quiz, and we did use Firestore or Firebase real-time database, one of the two. And we did find a bit of a challenge in terms of the latency. So with that, we took that, had that in mind when we did Adventure.
Okay, cool. Finally, how many users were connected during the event?
I don't know if I meant to say that metric, but I will say that we didn't reach that original we said that sort of max limit of 10,000, and we didn't get to 10,000. I'll say that much.
Okay, thank you. How do you integrate the mobile in the reflection of the game design? Did you think the game for mobiles first or not?
We didn't think of it really mobile first in my mind. I feel it's, yeah, like I don't know. I feel like because last year we knew that everyone would be mostly based from home, we thought people will probably have access to their laptop or their desktop, and that it would be okay to put more of the emphasis into the desktop experience. Obviously, I know that in many emerging markets, people are often like they just have a smartphone. But I think if you're a developer, which is the type of user you want for this conference, they're probably going to have a laptop or a desktop as well.
Yeah.
But did you like? Oh, and in terms of how we did design for it, so for mobile, we would keep like the chat collapsed, but you would like hit a button to open up the chat. But then having the micro chat bubbles in the game world kind of helped mean that you could still be walking along, and it was like overhearing someone talk about a topic you're interested in. Actually, in fact, another little extra feature we added was we had like a white list of words that were interesting, like React or like JavaScript, CSS, and we made it that those words were highlighted in all of the chat world. So that was also a fun little feature to help, kind of try to like replicate the feeling of when you hear a technology across the room that you're like, oh, I'm interested in that. You go and you try and talk to them.
Okay, makes sense. So, what are the Easter eggs?
Okay, yeah. Well, we had the Chrome Dino running around the world. So actually, I think I can like. Is it all right if I present again? Because I do have like a build like locally that I can like pull up.
Do you integrate the Konami code?
We did. Did someone actually just ask?
No.
We did integrate it. Let me just see if I've got. Bring it up. I should be able to. Just give me a second. I just want to like before I actually present it, I want to make sure that I'll be able to join fine. Because I'm like, well, it's pointed. Cool. So this is actually like what the game world looked like. And because actually, just because this build has me kind of like not logged in as an attendee, so I have like this kind of randomly generated name badge of Codified Ninja. But you can see here, like I can meet people in the world and collect like a virtual swag. So get like a fishing rod and equip it immediately. And then that allows me to actually take part in the fishing mini game like this. But I think someone, you said what was the Easter egg. So wait, I'm trying to remember the Konami code. So like up, up, down, down, left, right. Yeah, so it activates like a WebGL shader that does like ASCII art. Then it also unlocks like a game controller. I think this should, it only lasts a few seconds, but it's a pretty fun Easter egg. And then another thing is you can see there was like on the world map, there was kind of like this Chrome logo at the bottom. And if you like what we in the game world could noticed this kind of island to the east, and they were talking about it. And basically, if you enter into the URL bar as like a deep link, you write Chrome, I think, and I think I'll have to refresh. This should work. Then because it deep links you into that hidden island. So yeah, and there are people like saying that the trick to getting to the island is through the URLs. So yeah. Anyway, I'll stop presenting, but that's just a little bit of a peek into what Adventure was like.
So cool. So how did you integrate the code of conduct into the game?
Yeah, good question. So we had like the terms of service, standard sort of stuff that you agree to, and also you had to agree to the code of conduct guidelines that we normally have at conferences. And we had a reporting process where people would like report a user, and we had like a kind of support a mailing list. And then we did have moderators observing like the chat and just keeping an eye out for things. We also had a built-in profanity filter, which could kind of like get false positives as well. It's actually kind of difficult to write a good profanity filter, I discovered. But yeah, we had that kind of like moderation sort of side of things worked out in place. So yeah, and yes, there was a banning sort of functionality. I should add that.
Okay, cool. Will you keep an online access like that when you will be able to do in real life conference again?
That is a great question. It's not really like my level of decision to make, I think, but I think that there is some kind of opportunity to imagine a kind of like hybrid experience where people in real life conferences can like interact with people that couldn't come to the event in real life, and maybe through adventure or something like that, maybe there's some kind of some kind of way to marry the two experiences and connect to them would be an interesting exploration.
So do you think that hybrid web AR application is possible?
Yeah, so like doing that for the conference, I'm guessing like I'm guessing this question is about in relation to adventure. Yeah, I think that there's definitely something to be said for that. So you could imagine that if you have the physical real world conference, you could perfectly replicate it in the digital world. And then if I walk up to something in the digital world, maybe I can like chat to the person who is there in real life, who is also helping out at that booth, and try the exact same product demos, and maybe jump onto a virtual call together really easily, connecting both the people in real life with the people online, for example. Yeah, but I'm not sure how to bring in the AR component. I'm sure that there are opportunities there, though.
Do you think it could be used to something else than events like virtual office application?
I think so, yeah. So something I realized during the project is that it's like we're really trying to build like a nice like chat social platform. I actually thought like, oh, people are going to like make a joke about like Google building another chat platform with adventure, but I feel like it's really about creating that social experience, right? That you get at a conference or in an office. So I think that there is definitely stuff to explore with virtual offices as well, but I haven't really sunk a lot of time into that, I must admit.
So do you consider there you also answer the question? And I have another question. What is the most important advice you could give to someone who wants to create a multiplayer web game?
Yeah, good question. I would say probably one of the most important things was really testing the infrastructure ahead of time. Actually, we worked with someone from the cloud developer relations team here in Paris as well, called Valentin de la Place, and Valentin helped us like just test the server a huge amount by having, I can't remember how he did it exactly. He should give a talk about it actually. But he set it up so that he could like spawn like thousands of simulations of players that would then do the entire login process. So that way we were like really simulating the true reality of people getting onto the system. And we also did it that way because we knew that when we had done some projects in the past, that there were like things we didn't realize would be a problem, and like until it was like the real situation. So I really do recommend like testing as close to reality as possible, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries.
So anyone else has any question?
We've exhausted the audience.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you again, Tam. It was very interesting.
No worries. Yeah. Thanks.
For people who are too shy, we will switch again in 5 minutes of network mode. And so in order to ask your question to Tom. So Tom, again, thank you. I will cut the record now, and we'll switch again in network mode.
Okay, great.
Bye bye, everyone.